The gunman walked into Rosie's cafe at 11:47 on a Thursday morning, ordered nothing, and pulled a pistol from his jacket before the door had fully swung shut behind him. Marcus Deen was sitting in the corner booth, third from the left, the one closest to the window where the morning light came in at the right angle for reading. He had a cup of black coffee going cold on the table, a grilled cheese sandwich he'd barely touched, and exactly 45 minutes before he needed to pick his daughter up from school. He looked up from his book when the bell above the door chimed. He clocked the gun before most people in the cafe had even registered that something was wrong. Old habit, the kind you don't lose even when you spend years trying to. Marcus closed his book slowly, set it flat on the table, and did something that would confuse every single person in Rosie's cafe for the next several minutes. He said nothing, he did nothing. He sat completely, utterly still, hands visible on the table, eyes tracking the gunman with the quiet, measuring focus of a man running calculations that had nothing to do with panic. The screaming started around him. A woman near the counter knocked her chair back. Two college-age kids in the middle of the room scrambled toward the bathroom. The barista, a 20-something named Derek who Marcus saw every Thursday and who always remembered his order without being asked, froze at the register with both hands raised, face white. The gunman was in his mid-20s, Marcus estimated, jittery, breathing too fast, left hand shaking slightly, right hand steadier but not steady enough. He swept the gun across the room in the wide theatrical arc of someone who had practiced looking dangerous in a mirror, but had never actually been in a situation like this. Amateur, some quiet part of Marcus's brain noted, without judgment, just information. Everybody down, wallets, phones on the tables, now. Most people complied immediately, sliding to the floor, hands over heads. Marcus didn't go to the floor. He stayed in his booth, hands flat on the table, watching. The gunman's eyes found him across the room. "You! I said down!" "I heard you," Marcus said, calm and level, the voice of a man commenting on weather. "I'm not going to the floor, but I'm not a threat to you either. My hands are right here where you can see them." The gunman stared at him for 2 full seconds, thrown off by the response, recalibrating in real time. That was the first calculation Marcus needed him to make. People in the middle of a high adrenaline situation spend cognitive bandwidth on the unexpected. Every second the gunman spent trying to process why this one man wasn't on the floor was a second he wasn't moving, wasn't escalating, wasn't making the kind of panic decision that got people hurt. Marcus needed 30 more of those seconds. He just needed to keep the man's attention exactly where it was. And he needed everyone else in Rosie's cafe to stay exactly where they were, and trust that the guy sitting quietly in the corner booth with his cold coffee and his closed book knew what he was doing. This is that story. Marcus Deen had been living in Millbrook for 3 years, which meant Millbrook had 3 years of knowing him as exactly one thing: the quiet single dad who dropped his daughter off at Lincoln Elementary every morning, picked her up every afternoon, drove a clean but aging Ford pickup, and showed up at school events with a brand of steady, unassuming reliability that made teachers genuinely like him and other parents vaguely curious about what exactly he did for work. What he did for work currently was consulting, vague enough to be accurate, specific enough that nobody pushed further. He advised security firms on risk assessment, wrote occasional evaluations for government contracts, fielded calls, answered questions, signed NDAs that were still technically active on things he'd done in a previous life. That previous life was 12 years in the United States Special Forces, 4 combat deployments, and a final 2 years in a role he didn't have a job title for in any conversation he'd ever had with a civilian. He left the service at 32, not because he'd been asked to, not because anything had broken him beyond repair, but because his daughter, Nadia, was 4 years old and her mother, his wife, Maya, had been killed in a car accident 6 months earlier, and someone needed to be home. Someone needed to be there, present and consistent every single day for a little girl who had already lost one parent and couldn't afford to lose the other one to a life that kept him gone 8 months out of 12. So Marcus Deen came home, settled in Millbrook because Maya had grown up here, because her parents were here and could help, because there was a decent elementary school and a quiet neighborhood, and a corner cafe where they remembered your order and the light came in right in the morning. He built a small life, a careful life. He coached Nadia's soccer team, he went to every school recital, He made dinner every night and read to her every bedtime and taught her slowly and age-appropriately that the world had risks in it, but that risks could be understood and managed by people who stayed calm and paid attention. He never talked about what he used to be. Millbrook didn't need it to define him anymore. What he'd never quite figured out how to leave behind was the habit of watching every room he walked into the same way, cataloging exits, clocking distances, noting who was sitting where and what their hands were doing. He'd walked into Rosie's Café that morning the same way he'd walked into every room. Noted the exits, front door, kitchen door at the back left, fire exit behind the counter on the right. Noted the layout, counter along the left wall, 8 tables, the corner booths running along the right. Noted the 12 people in the room, their positions, their approximate ages, their distances from one another. He'd sat in the corner booth because it had sightlines to the entire room and his back was to the wall. Same as always. He hadn't expected to need any of it today. He never did. It was just the way he was built now, same as breathing. When the bell above the door chimed at 11:47, he looked up from his book and started running a different kind of calculation entirely. The gunman's name, Marcus would learn later, was Connell Mills, 24 years old, no prior felonies, 1 dismissed misdemeanor, a gambling debt that had grown in 6 months from something manageable to something that had taken on its own specific weight in his life, the kind of weight that makes people do things they would have told you a year earlier they were incapable of doing. None of that was visible to Marcus in the moment. What was visible was a young man in over his head, holding a weapon with more fear than intent, sweeping a room full of terrified civilians with the erratic energy of someone improvising in real time. A professional would have had a script. Connor Mills was making this up as he went. That was important information. Improvised situations were more dangerous in some ways, unpredictable, reactive, more likely to spike suddenly in the wrong direction. But they also had more openings, more moments of hesitation, more windows where a single, perfectly timed intervention could change everything before anything irreversible happened. Marcus was cataloging those windows while appearing to do nothing at all. The gunman moved to the counter, demanded the register. Derek, the barista, hands still raised, fumbling, managed to open the till and step back. Connor swept the cash into a bag without counting it, nervous, rushed, not thinking past the next 30 seconds. Phones. Everybody's phones on the floor, now. Compliance from the floor, phones sliding out from under tables. A woman near the window was crying quietly, holding her phone against her chest for a second before releasing it. An older man 3 booths down from Marcus had one hand pressed flat to the table and breathing visibly too fast, and Marcus noted that with a particular kind of attention. The man looked like a cardiac risk under this level of stress, which added a variable to the calculation he didn't like. Connor's jaw worked. The gun, Marcus noted, had dropped 3 inches, not consciously, not deliberately, the way people lower things when their full attention is pulled to something they're trying to process. That was the window. Not yet. One more beat. "What do you want?" Connor said, confused now, off script, negotiating with a man he'd meant to intimidate. "I want you to be done," Marcus said quietly. "I want you to take what you came for and walk out the front door. No police are here yet, you still have time, but the second you do anything to any of these people, that changes, permanently." 2 more inches. The gun was at hip level now. Marcus moved. It was over in 4 seconds. Not the dramatic, prolonged struggle of movies and television. No choreography, no back-and-forth exchange of punches, no extended grapple across tables while dishes shattered and civilians dove in every direction. 4 seconds, efficient and precise. The way things move when someone who knows exactly what they're doing meets a moment they've spent years preparing for, without ever planning to use. Marcus came out of the booth on the left side, angled low, covering the distance to Connor Mills in the time most people take to register that someone has moved at all. His right hand controlled the weapon, redirecting the barrel away from every human body in the room in the first half-second. His left arm came across Connor's chest in the second half-second. By second 2, Connor's back was against the counter, gun hand controlled and locked, weapon pointed harmlessly at the ceiling, and Marcus's voice was low and direct in his ear. "Done. It's done. Let go." Connor's hand opened, the gun came free. Marcus stepped back, weapon cleared and safed in a motion that took less than a second, and set it on the counter behind him without ever pointing it at another person. Connor Mills slid down the front of the counter and sat on the floor with his hands over his face, shaking. Marcus turned to the room, 12 people staring at him from the floor, from behind chairs, from the bathroom doorway where the two college-age kids had reappeared. "Everybody okay?" he said. Same voice, same level, unhurried calm. A beat of total silence. Then Derek, the barista, lowered his hand slowly and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "What just happened? Call 911, and could somebody check on the gentleman in booth 5? Sir, can you hear me? Can you take a slow breath for me?" The older man nodded, color starting to return to his face. "I'm all right," he managed. "I think I'm all right." "Good." Marcus pulled out his own phone and set it on the counter beside the cleared weapon. He wasn't going anywhere. He'd be here when the police arrived, answer everything they asked, give them everything they needed. No part of this was complicated, and no part of it needed to be anything other than exactly what it was. He sat back down in his corner booth while Derek called 911 with trembling hands, while the room slowly, cautiously began to breathe again. He picked up his coffee. It was cold now. He drank it anyway. His book was still open to the same page he'd been on when the door chimed. He didn't go back to reading. He just sat, hands visible on the table, and waited for the sirens. The police arrived in 6 minutes. 2 squad cars first, then a third, then a plain vehicle with a detective named Sandra Okafor, who shook Marcus's hand across the hood of a car and said, with the particular professional appreciation of someone who'd worked enough scenes to know the difference between luck and competence, "You want to walk me through that?" Marcus walked her through it. All of it, start to finish, without embellishment or false modesty. The same way he'd written operational reports for 12 years. What he observed, what he assessed, what he decided, what he did. Okafor listened without interrupting, made notes, asked 3 follow-up questions that told Marcus she was good at her job. "Former military?" she asked at the end, not accusatory, just reading the information in front of her. "Army," Marcus said. "Long time ago." Okafor nodded once, closing her notebook. "You have a very unusual idea of a quiet Thursday lunch." "Not usually," Marcus said. "Millbrook's generally pretty calm." She almost smiled. "Stay available for follow-up questions. We'll need a formal statement." "I'll be at Lincoln Elementary at 3:15. After that, I'm easy to reach." Nadia Dean was 7 years old, gap-toothed, and could read at a 5th grade level, which her teacher mentioned at every conference with the particular pride of someone who felt partially responsible for it, even though Nadia had been reading chapter books since before kindergarten. She was waiting at the school pickup line at 3:15, backpack straps gripped in both hands, scanning the line of cars with the focused, systematic efficiency she inherited from a father who checked every room he walked into. She spotted Marcus's truck, ran to it, climbed in, and had her seatbelt buckled before he'd fully come to a stop. "You're 12 seconds late," she announced. "I had a situation," Marcus said, pulling out of the line. "What kind of situation?" Marcus considered the question with the same care he gave to everything. Nadia was 7. She was also, in his completely unbiased assessment, one of the most perceptive 7-year-olds currently operating, and she had a reliable internal sensor for when her father was editing the truth. "Someone caused a problem at the cafe where I was having lunch. The police needed to talk to me about it. I helped sort it out." Nadia was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, which was her processing interval for information she was deciding whether to press on. "Were you scared?" Marcus said. "No." "Were other people scared?" "Yes, some of them." "Did you help them?" "I tried to." Another 4-second interval. Then, "Okay." And she pulled her library book out of her backpack and opened it to her bookmark, apparently satisfied, and said nothing more about it for the rest of the drive home. Marcus drove and breathed and let the ordinary afternoon settle back around him the way it always did after something that wasn't ordinary. The school carpool, the radio low, Nadia's quiet concentration in the back seat, the familiar streets of Millbrook unreeling through the windshield. This was the life. This was the thing he'd come home for. By the following morning, the story was everywhere. Local news first, then regional, then a clip that someone in Rosie's Café had filmed on their phone. Shaky, not entirely clear, but clear enough that spread through social media with the speed that only videos of extraordinary things done with extraordinary calm achieve. Comments flooded in by the thousands, most of them versions of the same question. Who is this guy? Marcus, by that point, had turned his phone off and taken Nadia to school. He didn't want to be a story. He never wanted to be a story. He wanted a quiet life in a town where people knew him as the dad at pickup and the soccer coach and the guy in the corner booth on Rosie's on Thursday mornings. He got 2 days of relative quiet before the media found his name through the police report, which was public record. And then there were reporters at his house, which was the specific kind of intrusion that Marcus Deen handled the way he handled most intrusions, by going very still, waiting for the moment, and then moving efficiently and without fanfare. He gave one statement, standing on his porch, short and clean. "I saw a situation where someone was going to get hurt. I had the training to prevent that. I'm glad nobody was injured. I'd prefer to get back to my life now." He went back inside and didn't answer the door again. What Marcus didn't know, what he had no particular way of knowing, being a man who didn't follow local social media and had no idea that the video had spread the way it had, was Rosie's Café had been full of regulars that Thursday morning, and regulars talk. One of them was a woman named Priya Anand who sat 2 tables from the counter, and who in the 4 seconds took Marcus to cross the room and end the situation, had her eyes opened and her head up in direct violation of the gunman's instructions, watching everything that happened with the focused attention of a woman who'd spent 10 years as an emergency room physician, and was calculating, same as Marcus, what the variables were and what the outcomes might be. She'd watched him move. She'd watched the whole thing, start to finish. She'd also been coming to Rosie's every Thursday for 8 months, and had never in that time made conversation with the man in the corner booth beyond the occasional nod of mutual recognition between 2 people who both liked the corner and the quiet. She told herself that was fine. She wasn't looking for conversation in her Thursday mornings either. Thursday was her one reliable morning off from the hospital, the one morning that belonged entirely to her, and she guarded it the way she guarded everything she needed to function, carefully, without apology. She sat in her car in Rosie's parking lot after the police finished with her, and thought about the man in the booth and the way he talked to the gunman. Not like a hero, not like someone performing bravery for an audience, but like a man trying to get everybody home safe, including the person holding the gun. She thought about it for longer than she expected to. The following Thursday, Rosie's Café reopened after 2 days of closure. Derek, the barista, had put a handwritten sign in the window that said "Back open, thank you for your patience," and underneath it, in smaller writing, "Marcus's coffee is on us forever." Marcus walked in at his usual time. The room was fuller than normal, people who'd heard the story and wanted to see the place, regulars who'd stayed away and were now returning, the particular energy of a community reclaiming a space that had been frightened for 48 hours. Derek had his order ready before he reached the counter, set it down without being asked, and said quietly, "We're real glad you were here." "I'm glad everybody's all right," and he meant it, and took his coffee to the corner booth. Priya Anand was in her usual spot 2 tables over. She looked up when he sat down. He looked up at the same moment. A beat of direct, mutual acknowledgement passed between 2 people who had been in the same room when something frightening happened and were both, in their own way, still processing it. "Thursday regular?" she said. "Thursday regular." Marcus confirmed. A pause, the kind that could go either way. "You knew exactly what you were doing," Priya said. "Not a question." "I had training that was relevant," Marcus said. "I got lucky, it was enough." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Priya said, with the particular precision of someone who spent her professional life distinguishing between outcomes that were random and outcomes that were the result of someone knowing exactly what they were doing. "I watched the whole thing. You were running a calculation from the moment he walked in." Marcus looked at her steadily. "So were you." She paused, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "You were the only other person in the room who kept their head up. You were checking his hands, checking distances, timing his attention. You're medical, I'd guess. Emergency." Priya studied him for a moment with an expression that landed somewhere between impressed and amused. "Emergency physician. 10 years. I figured," Marcus said. "You had the same look I did, assessing instead of panicking. It's a hard habit to break." "Yeah, it really is." Another pause, shorter this time, the kind that comes right before something shifts. "I'm Priya," she said. "Marcus," he said. "I know, you're on the news." He exhaled slightly, the specific exhale of a man who had been on the news for 2 days against his explicit preferences. That part I could have done without. Priya smiled then, quick, genuine, the kind of smile that lives in a person's eyes before it reaches their mouth.
For what it's worth, you handled the press conference with the same energy as the robbery. Very calm, very brief. Absolutely no unnecessary information. I prefer quiet Thursdays, Marcus said. So do I, Priya said. This one's been more eventful than most. They're not usually like this, Marcus said. Millbrook's generally pretty calm. So I've heard. Priya said and picked up her coffee, and they sat in their separate booths for a few more minutes before the conversation continued, slowly, unhurriedly, the way things begin between two people who are used to assessing situations carefully before they commit to anything. Neither of them rushed it. Neither of them needed to. Marcus picked Nadia up at 3:15, 12 seconds early this time, and she climbed in and buckled her seatbelt and said, "You seem different today." "Different how?" Marcus asked, pulling out of the line. Nadia considered the question with the focused seriousness she applied to most observations. Not bad different, just lighter, like when you finish fixing something that was broken. Marcus looked at her in the rearview mirror for a second, this 7-year-old person who had her mother's eyes and her father's instinct for reading a room. "I had a better Thursday than last week," he said. "Better how?" He thought about Priya Anand 2 tables over, the smile that lived in her eyes before it reached her mouth, the particular ease of 2 people who had both learned to assess situations carefully before they sat across from each other in the quiet of a Thursday morning with nowhere else they needed to be. "I made a friend," he said. Nadia nodded, apparently satisfied, and pulled out her library book. Marcus drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, the afternoon light coming through the windshield at the right angle, his daughter reading in the back seat, the radio low. This was the life, the whole of it. Ordinary and sufficient, and, on the right Thursday, more than he had expected. This is not a story about a hero. Marcus Deen would be
the kind of person who, in the days following the incident, went about his life with a deliberate, almost stubborn normalcy that made the people around him simultaneously grateful and slightly bewildered. He took Nadia to soccer practice on Saturday morning, same as always, standing on the sideline in his usual spot with his arms crossed and his coffee in hand, calling encouragement in the same even voice he used for everything. 3 other parents recognized him from the news clip and didn't know how to bring it up, so they stood a little closer than usual and said nothing, which Marcus understood was its own kind of acknowledgement and appreciated more than anything they could have said. On Sunday, he fixed the kitchen faucet that had been dripping for 2 weeks and hadn't made it to the top of the list. He made Nadia her requested dinner, spaghetti, extra parmesan, garlic bread on the side, and they watched a nature documentary about deep-sea creatures that Nadia narrated over with additional commentary that was, in Marcus's assessment, more accurate than what the actual narrator was saying. On Monday, he had a call with one of his consulting clients, a firm that did security assessment for a mid-sized logistics company, and spent 40 minutes on the phone walking them through a risk evaluation that had nothing dramatic in it at all. Just methodical, careful analysis of variables and outcomes, which is what most of his work actually looked like from the inside, stripped of the parts that occasionally became news clips. It was Detective Okafor who called him on Tuesday afternoon, not with follow-up questions, but with an update she said he thought he'd want. Connor Mills had been charged. He'd cooperated fully with the investigation, provided a complete account of events, and in the course of that account had said something Okafor thought Marcus should hear. "He said you were the only person in that room he believed," Okafor told him. "He said when you told him no one needed to get hurt, you were the only person who'd said anything to him in weeks that sounded like it was actually meant for him instead of at him." Marcus was quiet for a moment on his end of the call. "I'm not saying that excuses anything. It doesn't. But I thought you'd want to know what came out of it." "I appreciate you telling me," Marcus said. He sat at his kitchen table after the call, Nadia doing homework at the other end, and thought about Connor Mills on the floor with his hands over his face, shaking. 24 years old, a debt that had grown into something that swallowed his judgment whole. Marcus was 24 years old once, in places far more dangerous than a cafe in Millbrook, making decisions under pressure that he'd had years of training to prepare him for. Connor had had nothing. Just fear, and a bad plan, and a room full of strangers who happened to include one man with 12 years of institutional knowledge about what people do when they're in over their heads and terrified. He didn't feel sorry for what Connor had done.
He felt something more complicated than that, a recognition maybe of the distance between where a person starts and where they end up when the pressure gets high enough and there's no one in their life trained to help them calculate the way out. He didn't share that thought with anyone. It wasn't the kind of thing that translated cleanly into conversation. He just held it, quietly, the way he held most things that mattered. Wednesday, he picked Nadia up from school, and she asked on the drive home whether he had any friends. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "What made you ask that?" "Madison's dad has a best friend from college who comes over and watches football, and Jackson's mom has a friend named Deb who she talks to on the phone every day. I was just wondering if you had someone like that." Marcus considered the question honestly. He had colleagues. He had Maya's parents, who were more family than friends, but present and real. He had the easy, nodding familiarity of Derek at the cafe and the other school parents, and the parents on Nadia's soccer team. "I'm working on it," he said. Nadia looked at him in the mirror with an expression that was, somehow, both 7 years old and ancient. "The doctor lady?" she said. Marcus had mentioned Priya Anand once in passing, briefly, while explaining why his Thursday had been better than the previous one. He had not described her as a doctor or as a lady specifically or with any detail whatsoever beyond the word friend. "How did you—" "You smiled when you said it," Nadia said simply, and went back to her library book. Marcus drove the rest of the way home in silence, which was the only dignified response available to him, and thought about Thursday morning and the corner booth, and a woman with quick eyes who read rooms the same way he did, and had been sitting 2 tables away for 8 months without either of them doing anything about it. He thought maybe this Thursday he'd sit 1 table closer. Nothing dramatic, just a little closer. The way things move when they're moving at the right pace. Not rushed, not forced, just following the natural direction of something already in motion, one quiet Thursday at a time. The first to tell you that, and mean it without false modesty. Heroes are people who act without preparation, without training, without the cold calculation that makes extraordinary things look easy from the outside. What Marcus did in Rosie's Café on a Thursday morning was the application of 12 years of training, 3 years of careful civilian living, and 45 seconds of precise decision-making by a man who had learned a long time ago, in circumstances he never discusses, that the difference between outcomes in high-pressure situations almost always comes down to the person who stays calmest the longest. He didn't want a story. He wanted his cold coffee and his book and 3:15 pickup. But this is a story about something else. It's about a man who left a life that made him exceptional at things he hoped he'd never need again, to become ordinary in the best possible way. Present, consistent, there every morning and every afternoon for a little girl who needed one parent to show up without fail. It's about what that kind of steady dailiness does for a person, and for a kid, and for a neighborhood that didn't know what it had in its corner booth until a door chimed at 11:47 on a Thursday morning and found out. And it's about a quiet Thursday the week after. 2 people with the same habit of watching every room they walked into, finally watching the same room at the same time and deciding, without rushing it, that maybe it was worth introducing themselves. Some things end, some things begin. Most of the important ones happened on ordinary Thursdays when all you came in for was a cup of coffee and a grilled cheese sandwich, and the afternoon was supposed to be simple. And sometimes that's exactly how the best parts of your life find you, in a corner booth, hands visible on the table, waiting. Drop a comment. What's your most embarrassing wrong text story? Subscribe for more stories like this. Share this with someone today.